Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to welcome you all in person in this room and many on Zoom. It's a webinar that will be recorded and broadcast, so hope nobody has any objection to that. Very happy to have this event to release the book, India Palestine. We are very grateful to the library event series for hosting us, and also the SOAS HR History, Religion and Philosophy Department for providing some of the funds to travel. Welcome to Victor Kattan, who with Amit Ranjan has edited the book. I'm welcoming him back to his alma mater. So he did his PhD here. In fact, when he was doing his PhD, I used to teach a course on comparing India-Palestine partition in 2009 for a couple of years. And so there's a very old genesis to this project, but I'm very happy to see it happen. And Victor will introduce the book and talk about it shortly. I welcome all our speakers as well. And their credentials. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So, and I welcome you all with that little discount code. So hopefully, if anybody wants to buy the book, you can use the SOAS 30 code. And then you order it on the NUP website. So welcome to the event. Victor, I'm not going to read out everybody's credentials because they are impressive and long. And I'm so glad that they're here, but they are also here to speak. So we will keep more time for that. So I have that on the slides for everybody's information, but I'm not going to read out everybody's biographies, but very welcome to Mohamed-Ali Adraoui. He's joining us from Paris and teaches at Radboud University in the Netherlands. He's had a long publication. If you go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. He's got a lot of publications working on the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood, and he will talk about his contribution to the book shortly. Our next speaker will be, so it should have been Arie Dubnov. I switched it, sorry. The first is Arie Dubnov, after that, Mohamed-Ali. And Arie Dubnov is visiting us from George Washington University in the US. He's a named chair professor there, and he has published on Jewish liberal thought as well as partition in the international context. And you can see his impressive list on the slides. So very welcome here. Arie, after that, we will have Victor speak again about his contribution. So not only has he edited the book, but he has also written after Mohamed-Ali. Yes, sorry, I switched the introduction around, but we'll keep that order. I mean, there is the only logic behind the order is the surnames. So I thought I'll do it like that. And after we will have Laura. So I'm very welcome to her. She's coming, she's here from Penn State University. And I'm very. Sorry, can you speak up, please? Oh, yeah, thank you. I said I was welcoming Laura Robson. Professor Robson is here from Penn State University in the US as well. So very grateful to both of them making this long journey to speak to us and share their thoughts on their contribution in this book, but perhaps they can also reflect on the greater issues of comparing these partitions. After these presentations, we will, next slide, we will have respondents to the book by Nandini Chatterjee. She is at Exeter University and has recently been appointed to the University of Oxford. She's worked on the broad comparative Persianate field in the Indian Ocean world, law and empire in this over the long durée from the Mughals to the modern times in India, or to the 19th century in India. So I'm really looking forward to her comments on the book and the different contributions. Last but not least, Professor Atef Alshaer. He's at University of Westminster. He will be one of the respondents as well, and he's worked on nationalism and Palestine and literature and nationalism, so bringing in culture and politics as well. So welcome to all of us and to all of you for making the time to hear about the book and ask questions. We are going to try and keep the presentations within the hour and then an hour for discussions and questions. Those online can give the questions on the Q&A box or maybe the chat as well. Yeah, and maybe when we are discussing it, you can unmute yourselves and talk. Yes, and Charles is very grateful to Charles for coordinating everything from organizing this place as well and hosting the event on the webinar. So he will help us answer the questions in the question session. So I'll switch now with Atef. If you like, join us here. You're okay then? All right. When you're speaking, then because for the webinar, the camera will be easier here. All right. Okay. So without much ado, then I ask Victor, please, to introduce the book to everybody.
Thank you very much, Amrita. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be back at SOAS after so many years, and it's a tribute to you, Amrita, for bringing so many of us together in person. I think half the authors or half the contributors to this book are actually here. It's quite a feat with funding cuts and everything else. So that's a very impressive. So I was based at the National University of Singapore for many years before I returned to the UK during the pandemic, and this project began in Singapore. The next slide. So it was a joint initiative by the Middle East Institute, where I was based at the time as a senior research fellow, and the Institute of South Asian Studies, where my colleague Amit Ranjan is a fellow, and it was organized in this rather beautiful room at the Asia-Europe Foundation and this kind of tropical rainforest. We did it on the 70th anniversary of the partition of India. And at the time, the Middle East Institute was headed by Professor Eng Seng Ho, who's a well-known historian and anthropologist based at Duke University, but originally from Malaysia. And what he was trying to do at the time was to create a distinctive Middle East Institute in Singapore to do something different to what Middle East Institutes do in London or in Washington, DC. And so his main area was looking at Indian Ocean diasporas and movement of people and culture between Arabia and Southeast Asia. And so we were encouraged to do comparative projects, comparative work to make it stand out to other institutes. So there were two projects I was involved with. One was comparing the legal arguments about the Vietnam War and the Arab-Israeli conflict. The second project was this one, comparing partition in India in 1947 to what's happening in Palestine around the same time. So the project came together. We had quite a mix of scholars. We have international historians, we have lawyers, we have political scientists. So it was a multidisciplinary, if you like. The next slide. So the book's published by Manchester University Press. If you click on the link, will it on the link there, does it work? Just to give you an overview of what you might expect to see, and you click on the table of contents. Third one. Brilliant, yeah. So the way in which the book is structured is we have some big names like revisiting their canonical work. So Ayesha Jalal, who's written a lot on Pakistan, history of Pakistan, the partition of the Punjab, was asked to revisit her work on Mohamed-Ali Jinnah's role, and Ian Talbot has done a lot of work on the Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, kind of revisited his work. And then we had scholars, two of whom are with us today, looking at the partition of Palestine, and then comparative work by Amrita and Professor PRS Kumaraswamy. And then we looked at consequences, because we don't see partition as something that began and ended in 1947, or I should say the failed partition in Palestine or the forced partition of Palestine and in India, but events that continue to have repercussions and influence the politics of both regions today. And some of the speakers will be saying more about this. the point of doing the comparison is not to say that they're identical or they're the same, but also to look at the differences. And if we go to the next slide. And so we did something that was different to previous scholarship. So previous work, including that by Arie and Laura, who are with us today, and older work by the Irish historian T.G. Fraser, tended to look at the tripartite partitions, Ireland, India and Palestine. But we thought it was worth focusing just on India and Palestine, principally, but not exclusively, because of the time reason. So there's this particular moment in international politics when the Soviet Union emerged on the stage and influenced international relations. There was this discourse of national self-determination. There was a decolonization in the third world, if you like, began after World War II. Whereas in the Irish case, they're still using civilizational language. It's still a white European Christian state that's articulating a claim to nationhood. It's a different historical moment. And of course, apart from the similarity in terms of the timing of the partitions, was the fact that the colonial power was the same, the British Empire, although the status of the territories was of course different. Palestine being a League of Nations mandate, and India being essentially a colony of the British Empire. We turn to the next slide. And of course, if we're talking about partition, we're talking about a subcontinent. We're looking at Punjab and Bengal, and then the war over Kashmir. Whereas Palestine was really a unit or subunit of the Ottoman Empire when it was carved out after the First World War. And another big difference between the two, of course, is Palestine. There wasn't such the colonialism on the scale in India as there was in Palestine, which also affected the arguments that were advanced in favor and against partition. Then there are personalities where there's similarities in terms of those who are articulating or supporting or opposing partition, whether that was British colonial officials, Coupland and others who Arie and Amrita have written about, or whether it was views of the Muslim League, the All India Muslim League, kind of opposing the partition of Palestine, articulating a claim to majority rule. Also Jinnah as well, Jawaharlal Nehru as well, coming out at that time in opposition to the partition of Palestine, having accepted it in India. So there's some quite interesting juxtaposition work to be seen, comparing why in certain cases they favored partition, but in other cases they were opposed to it. Last slide. So without much further ado, we're going to let my colleagues discuss their individual chapters, and I'll discuss mine as well. I think we're going to start with Arie.
Okay.
Thank you, Victor. First and foremost, congratulations to you on bringing together such a stellar collection of authors, and also doing the the always ungrateful work of being an editor. The metaphor of cat herding is also used in that respect, and thank you, Lynn, for bringing us together. So I'll try to be brief. My two cents or 10 minutes. I'll try to briefly highlight the main points of my intervention in the chapter that the chapter I contributed to this volume. My chapter focuses on the 1948 war in Palestine and tries to do a global reframing and to think about whether we can think about it in new ways by, so to speak, rebranding it or recalling it a war of partition. And I'll maybe say a few words about how the backstory, how I came to write it. In a sense, it grew out of a deep frustration from the existing historiography. I think that much of what the appeal project of this kind has to do with the fact that over the years, nationalist and local histories accumulated a lot of information about the local partitions. We know extremely well and extremely well detailed chronicles, of course, of the different events taking place in Palestine. Very detailed analysis of what's going on in the Punjab and Bengal and other areas. But much of the historiography, especially when it comes on the Israeli side, is suffering from a heavy mythological nationalism. So it's a very nationalistic history. It reads everything from a nationalist point of view. By saying I'm trying to move away from it, I'm not saying I am discarding the tools of nationalism studies. I think we live in a time and an age when the insights of nationalism studies is still relevant. What I mean by methodological nationalism is a tendency to read history in a very teleological way. Everything, all the roads lead to Rome, and all the historical processes lead to the creation of an independent state. And also lack of willingness sometimes to zoom out to see the case not only in its uniqueness, of course, every historical case is unique, but to see distinct patterns of similarity. So sort of a bit of a forest versus tree phenomena that is taking place there. And also by reading the source materials themselves, the primary sources. I'm trained as a historian. It strikes me often to see how the documents coming from the period reveal historical agents that are much less parochial than we are often. They are acutely aware of the fact that they are part of an imperial setting. They are busy constantly comparing themselves to other places. They have almost sometimes an understanding of some sort of a butterfly wings effect, that even a development elsewhere in the empire, remote as it may sound, might have a ripple effect and will come to them. And this is part of what kind of pushed me in that direction. On a more positive note, it was kind of a part of what I was trying to do is, of course, to follow, a sequel to what I had the pleasure of working on with Laura when we put the three partitions together and start talking not only about comparing them, but identifying a transnational connection between them. So if we try to move beyond Fraser's older story and maybe is really to take the imperial term seriously and to do a transnational history that not only puts all the three cases or the two cases side by side, but saying the similarities are not coming out of nowhere. There are clear dots connecting them. So what is happening if we are starting to think about the war taking place in Palestine in 1947-8, officially starting the official chronicles, the war the Palestinians will call the Nakba, the Israelis will call the War of Independence, starts on the day after Resolution 181 is passed in the UN, which is the partition resolution. So what happens if we start thinking about it as a war of partition and seeing it in that context? So part of what I'm trying to suggest in the chapter is that many of these political actors have in their mind the partitioned space, and the aim of the violence is to turn the theory into something which is actual on the ground. The war also starts in the phase where the British are still present in Palestine. So the war starts in November 1947. The British are still there until May 1948. So part of what you see already in these immediate first phases are patterns of violence that are strikingly similar to other places of partition violence. What I've also tried to do in the chapter is to scrutinize, even put it more boldly, discard older narrations and conceptualizations of that war. For instance, there was a tendency among some historians, both Palestinians and Israeli, to call the first phase of the war a civil war. The idea of calling it a civil war was simply to allude to the fact that nominally there was still British mandatory presence, and communities were starting to clash. And this is something you can find both in Walid Khalidi's early works and also in historians like Benny Morris. And it started as a periodization, actually, device to say, how do I call the first phase of the war? Part of what I'm trying to argue in the chapter is that it's a bit of a misnomer. It really misses the dynamic. It's completely divorced from the way on the Jewish side, when they were thinking, when they were employing metaphors of civil war, it was always an intra-Jewish debate. So these were internal strifes between different brands of Zionism, fighting between the left-wing Zionists and the right-wing Zionists. This is where you see in the historical records attempts to call it civil war. But the ethno-nationalist logic of that conflict that really makes the civil war metaphor a bit of a misnomer that is not serving us well analytically. The second term that I tried to discard is total war for different reasons. I will not go into them now. And the last point is to argue that, and that alludes to a comment Victor made earlier, and I think is very correct. And this is my cue. Partition is not only this one big bang, very violent, that is only about the war. Partition is an ongoing project, and often partition is something that is achieved later on through bureaucrats, from clerics, from legal scholars that are creating sets of laws that turn the partition to a reality on the ground. And that's kind of the last argument of the chapter. So my time is up. So I will pass the baton to the next speaker.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to my dear brother, Victor. Actually, we have met in Singapore. So this place that you have seen is basically where we have mingled for so many years, Victor and I and family. So thank you very much for the invitation. I was extremely happy, honored to be part of this very, very, very exciting project and to be here with such distinguished colleagues. So I will try to say a few words on another side of the partition, Palestine, that India. I'm more interested in the Near and the Middle East. Let's say, basically, I was trained as a political scientist with a bit of history work dealing with the Middle East history and contemporary periods. And within this, let's say, if I had to describe myself, I'm more interested in the fields of political Islam studies or Islamist studies. And my chapter in this volume had to deal basically with how an Islamist movement, and I'm going to try to give some definitions in a few seconds, has tried or has de facto reacted to a partition of a land called Palestine that was never seen as a territory, as a land, of course, with a population, with all the symbolical side of it, as a land, as a fact that was meant to be taken away from the Muslims. Palestine with, of course, a very strong Arab nationalistic importance, but maybe first and foremost because we are dealing here with Islamist forces, an Islamist movement, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, with a very strong, super strong, maybe first and foremost religious appeal, religious importance. So, and that's my first set of remarks. Second one, when I started, thinking about this presentation, a title came to my mind actually, because of course we have no one here ignores what's going on, today in the Gaza Strip and beyond. And that has been going on actually for so many years, but more accurately in the next few months. I would like to suggest this idea because this title could be nothing new, ? Let's try to go back to the longue durée. Why do I use this expression, nothing new? It's because if we look at the archives, how this Syrian Muslim Brother organization has reacted in terms of discourses, in terms of mobilizations, in terms of actions, this partition plan, actually we have many similarities with what's going on today. Everybody knows here, I presume here knows about Hamas, which is an Islamist force within the Palestinian political and religious field. We know about some of their, let's say, key, strong, characteristics in terms of ideology, in terms also of political types of mobilizations. And actually, we find many of these characteristics, actually, if we start discussing and studying the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood 60, 70, 80 years ago. So for example, just to give you, to start with this, oh my God, what's happening here? Oh God, sleep. Sorry, what's happening? Okay. I'm trying to. So how, I want to give you a few attempts of different definitions. The Muslim Brotherhood is supposed or is usually described, characterized as the first strong key Islamist player in the history of the Middle Eastern countries. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the late 20s in Egypt with a teacher called Hassan al-Banna. And quite rapidly, actually, this movement, and of course with the ideology coming with this movement, it started actually to generate offshoots across the region, first and foremost, and then at a global level. Syria is one of the very first countries actually where the Muslim Brotherhood ideology has settled. And we usually consider that the mid-40s is the time basically when the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood starts to emerge. So the partition plan actually came quite quickly, 1 or 2 years after the foundation or the creation of this Islamist organization in the Syrian political and religious spectrum or field. And number two, we usually and I'll be happy to discuss this with my colleagues in a few minutes, we usually consider actually whether it's right or wrong that nationalists have been the key force, the initial original key force in the pro-Palestine and anti-partition mobilization types of or set of mobilizations. And actually we could reconsider this with by focusing and going back to the history of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, because for example, right from the beginning, right just before the partition plan, October, everybody knows here, presumably, that the partition plan happened in the late November 1947. In early October 1947, already we have the Damascus Committee, which is a creation. It was generated by the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood as the first committee, the Damascus Committee, in order actually to mobilize the Syrian people and to, let's say, make people aware of the fact that a real danger, threat. I'm talking here. I'm using the words that the Muslim Brothers at the time used to characterize the situation through. And actually, starting in October 1947, with this Damascus Committee, the first types of Islamists, the first generation, let's call it this way, of Syrian Islamist reactions and mobilization started to be observed. Actually, so right from the beginning. So even a few weeks, actually, at some point prior to the partition plan, and the trend from this moment onwards is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So I would be happy to give you a few examples of this, a few declarations. For example, we have the one of the main leaders of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, starting almost right from the beginning. We are here now in October 1947, starting to use or to call people for violence. For example, I can tell you a few. I can mention a few examples. For example, they are saying one of them, a very famous Syrian Muslim Brotherhood leader, Mohamed Mubarak, was right from the beginning. So we have in the 3rd October 3, 1947, we have a very famous speech in which he was calling for Palestine, or he was asking for Palestine to be defended through bloodsheds and things like that. So it's going to be stronger and stronger. And after the partition plan, when it was officially declared in November 29, 1947, a few days after that, another very strong type of mobilization is going to be observed in early December 1947, December 4, with the so-called first, according to me at least, I mean in the Syrian context, the first official proclamation of jihad. It was a proclamation made by, not only here in this case, to be honest, Muslim Brothers or Muslim Brother leaders, it was made by the League of Ulama, so the League of Islamic Scholars, Rabit al-Ulama in Damascus. And it was, and I will be happy to tell you, to give you the extract, I mean, to give you the content of this. So the first, let's say, and of course, jihad, we all know here, I mean, probably, at least we should, that jihad is a very diverse, has generated very sometimes opposite diverse understandings, but here in this case, it's clearly a reference to a very violent form of jihad in order to defend Palestine, which is no longer here described and led to be defended on behalf of some nationalistic discourse or symbols or narratives. Here clearly, of course, I mean, they had a very, very famous nationalistic, I mean, very nationalistic, I mean, motivation, but also maybe first and foremost, we have here right from the beginning in this period of time in early December 1947, a kind of Islamization of this call of this motivation of keeping Palestine away from the Zionist forces. So I'm happy here to give you some extract of this very famous proclamation. So quotes in quotes. So here we have a very famous Muslim brother being part of this League of Scholars who is speaking here. The Palestine question today preoccupies the Arabic and Islamic words. So not only the Arabic words, the Arabic and Islamic words. Every Arab and every Muslim prepares himself to fulfill his duty against the falling Zionist imperial, which is supported by the great imperialist power with all their force and influence. Having considered the seriousness of the situation in Palestine, the League of Ulama, scholars, Islamic scholars, finds it is its duty to declare the necessity of jihad in money and source for the restoration of the unity of Palestine and its Arab structure. Islam, which by nature tends towards peace, does not accept aggression and transgression and cannot stand still before slavery and injustice. In such a case, Islam requires each capable person to fulfill his duty in jihad until God makes him a martyr or the Almighty gives a victory and success to his country. And I could go on and on and on. So this idea, for example, that nationalism had prevailed in the beginning can be discussed, by focusing and studying, the importance of the Muslim Brotherhood based or designed types of mobilizations. And I would like to end up on one idea, and I hope I'm not going to be too long. It's if we, once again, one more time goes to this longue durée necessity, we can also figure out actually the idea that the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian the struggle for Palestine has also in the long term be a driving force, both ideologically, but also we tend to forget that, and I'll be happy to give you more evidence of this, sociologically, in the consolidation of Islamist forces throughout the Middle East for so many decades. And I'll be happy to give you more examples, but we know that without Palestine, that's one of the ideas I would be happy to defend here and to discuss, of course, that without the Palestinian factor, Islamism would have probably not been framed or shaped the same way it is or it has been in the last for the last decades. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much. Victor, please.
Slide. Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's great to hear from Arie and Mohamed-Ali. So my chapter looks at, there's a comparison between the partitions of India and Palestine, and I argue that this notion of majority rule, this idea that it's for the majority population of a given unit to determine their political destiny, emerges from the debates in opposition to attempts by the United Nations to partition Palestine, and also discussions amongst Muslim League leaders who are opposed to partition, initially opposed to partition in India. And the All India Muslim League favoured a form of majority rule, but only in the areas where Muslims formed the majority of the population. And you can imagine why, they were worried about this notion of what they called a Hindu Raj, that they were worried about the communal. They would be a minority in a single unitary state, and therefore a federal structure was more suitable following the departure of the British. So it looked at these debates, it looked at attempts by the All India Muslim League to challenge British colonial policy in Palestine, including debates on going to what was called the Permanent Court of International Justice just before World War II. And I draw comparisons to a later attempt by Ethiopia and Liberia to use a similar clause in another treaty to challenge apartheid in South Africa. I look at the role of Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, who was a judge on the Federal Court of India, a prominent leader of the Muslim League, the first foreign minister of Pakistan, and then a judge and president of the International Court of Justice. And I draw attention to the fact that they came out against the Pakistan scheme as early as 1940. And then
Palestine scheme.
The Pakistan scheme. They came out opposed to partition. I'll show you a slide shortly. In 1940. And so it kind of feeds into what Ayet Jalal argues, that Jinnah only succumbed to partition because he was placed under tremendous pressure to accept it. in the final hour, but they preferred the cabinet mission plan. I then show how both Pakistan and India, when they became members of the United Nations, both voted against the United Nations partition plan for Palestine. And again, in opposition, they were articulating language and discourse based on this idea that national self-determination meant majority rule. And then I explained how that idea then feeds into debates against minority rule in Southern Africa, in the struggle against apartheid. So one of the issues that I highlight in the chapter is this attempt to challenge British colonial policy during the mandate, which hasn't received much attention in the literature. This is a picture of Chatterjee, who was a very senior member of the All India Muslim League. He travels to London in 1939. Some of you will know the British essentially abandoned the Balfour Declaration in their famous white paper. And prior to that, there was a meeting, a roundtable meeting with leaders of the Arab world. What's not so well known is that the All India Muslim League, despite not being invited, turned up and were advising the Arabs from behind the scene. It's quite interesting. Actually, I advised the Palestinians to accept the white paper because they said the Brits would never, if you accept it, eventually they will leave and you will have majority rule in any event. But anyway, the Palestinians rejected it. But during the sidelines of this discussion, there were discussions. They made a formal complaint to the British Colonial Office about a legal complaint based on this notion of sacred trust of civilization in the League of Nations covenants. And they also spoke to League of Nations officials in Geneva about trying to bring a case. I don't think they would have succeeded in bringing that case for various reasons I won't go into, but the fact that they were thinking along the lines of using the dispute settlement clause in the mandate to challenge the policies of the colonial power is just absolutely fascinating if you're a lawyer, because this is exactly the same way in which South Africa's apartheid policy was challenged in Namibia. So next slide. And so it's also quite intriguing another key figure was this gentleman, Mohamed-Ali Adraoui, and he was very close to Jinnah, and he again came out opposing population transfers. You know, he opposed this idea of creating a sovereign Pakistan state because he knew there were as many, if not more, Muslims living in other parts of India as they were in the Punjab and the northwest frontier, Punjab, Bengal, and other places. And so they actually implored them to abandon what they called the Pakistan scheme because it would be utterly impractical and would result in nothing but misery and suffering, and can therefore make no contribution towards the solution of India's problems. Kind of intriguing, given some people claim that the Muslim League wanted partition. But what's key to understand is that they favoured nationhood in those areas where the population was the majority. And of course, the partition was done in a form of majority rule, dividing tehsils between majority Muslim and non-Muslim populations. And then that led to, as you all know, the horrors of the Holocaust in the Indian subcontinent and a massive movement of people suffering until this day. So during this time, in the aftermath of the Second World War, when India and Pakistan become independent states, the Palestine issue returns or is placed on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly. And we have a photograph here of Mohamed-Ali Adraoui with eventually become King Faisal and Egyptian leaders, and he was advising them. So he's a very prominent lawyer, and he was advising them essentially how to deal with the imperial powers, being very skilled and familiar with these issues themselves. So he delivers an extremely powerful and eloquent speech. If you haven't seen it, I think you watched on the UN website now, explaining why the partition plan was madness, because it was according sovereignty to large parts of Palestine where Arabs continue to be either the majority population or the majority of landowners, and explain why this was completely contrary to self-determination that had just been proclaimed by the United Nations. If you go to the last slide, I then explain how these arguments based on majority rule coming out of these debates in the Indian subcontinent, coming out of the debates on the partition of Palestine, plus the movement, the independence of a lot of North African countries in the and Indonesia in the late 1940s and early 1950s results in this articulation that democracy means majority rule. It's a flawed interpretation, of course, but this kind of powerful nationalistic a notion of self-determination. Then it feeds, I also show how it feeds into discrediting apartheid in South Africa, which initially began as a debate about the status of individuals of Indian origin. It was never just about one man, one vote, or based on complete non-discrimination. Initially, the UN, I'm talking about the official diplomatic structures, was focused on the status of individuals of Indian South Asian descent. But what happened in 1952 is this new agenda is brought to the General Assembly. It's letter by mostly Muslim majority countries is written, and they, for the first time, break that focus purely on individuals of South Asian origin and say, no, apartheid is wrong because it discriminates against all non-white South Africans. So I draw those links, and that's how I kind of end the chapter. Thank you very much.
Laura.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Amrita, for bringing us together, which is a remarkable accomplishment, I think. And to Victor for editing this wonderful volume. I have very fond memories of the conference in Singapore, which was a lovely gathering. And a conversation that has continued, over the subsequent years. And I'm really delighted to have this volume appearing as kind of the manifestation of that conversation. So this is a volume that talks about partition as a tool of various kinds of enterprises, as a tool of empire, as a tool of nationalism, as a tool of Islamism. And the chapter that I contributed to this book talks about partition as a tool of a kind of emerging internationalism, and I'm going to put that term in quotes for reasons that I think you'll see. And so it did this by focusing in on a particular moment in 1947 when the very new, novel indeed in some ways, United Nations put together what it called a Special Commission on Palestine, UNSCOP, sent it to the region to figure out a quote unquote solution to the problem of Palestine, and came up with two different proposals. One of which is known as the majority proposal, and I think that the use of that term is an interesting one as well, which proposed partition and was put to the vote in the General Assembly in November of 1947 and passed, and a minority proposal, which had a different vision for what could happen to Palestine, and proposed something more akin to a federal state that would incorporate both Jews and Arabs, and I think importantly, would assign Palestine's quote unquote holy places to the UN directly. So this is, I want to note just a couple of major things about this moment. One is just a kind of straightforward historiographical point, which is that this federal minority proposal that was put forward by certain members of UNSCOP is insufficiently investigated in the literature, right? And we would think that in a field like Palestine-Israel, which is so oversubscribed and perhaps even kind of overwritten in so many respects, that something like this would have received a great deal of attention, and it has not, right? So I just want to kind of flag that. I think we could think about why that might be. But in fact, it's a very interesting document, and it represents a remarkable and wide-ranging set of dissenting opinions on the legitimacy and the viability of the idea of partition, but also about the scope and the nature of the political authority that is being proposed for the new United Nations, right? And so I think that this is a straightforward point that there is more to be written about this moment, about these set of ideas, about the ways in which there was considerable dissent, not just about partition itself, but also about the kind of role that the UN could be expected to play in the making of post-colonial states. So that leads me to the second major point here, which has to do with the UN's own self-prescribed role in the making of the kind of decolonial world. And I think Palestine in 1947, and not for the first time, offered an opportunity for people interested in concepts of what they thought of as internationalism to declare their institutions to be the arbiter of things like borders, of populations, of territories, of sovereignty in the post-1945 world, just as empires had been in the pre-1945 world. And it's important, I think, you know, it's easy to look back on this moment. We all know what came of it, right? And to see this as a kind of inevitability. But I think it is really crucial to remember that in 1948, nothing about this was a foregone conclusion. Not what happened in Palestine, and not what the UN became, right? Not the kinds of claims that it eventually made, the kind of institutions it eventually came to comprise, right? None of this had been established yet, right? This is a moment of negotiation. So I think that's quite an important point to make, that this investigation about this federal proposal can lead us towards. So just to draw out a few of the details, I won't go into this in kind of great depth, but first of all, a little bit of background. I'm sure that most of you know that the first proposal for the partition of Palestine, official proposal, came from the 1937 Peel Commission, which imagined the segregation of the territory into a Jewish state and, excuse me, an Arab territory that would be joined in some unspecified way to Transjordan. And I think I'll note in passing that I think this aspect of non-statehood for the Palestinian Arab piece of the partition proposal is actually quite important, particularly as it was repeated by UNSCOP in 1947. And in fact, I think it's arguable that there was never a partition plan in these decades that represented any sort of vision for actual sovereignty for the Palestinian part of the equation. And in any case, the Peel Commission had proposed that this plan would be accomplished via forcible transfer, and anticipated something like 300,000 Arabs needing to be moved and about 1,250 Jews needing to be moved out of their respective areas to create what it saw as an appropriate demographic majority in the Jewish state. When this question of partition was raised once again in 1947, as the British were planning to leave their mandatory territory in Palestine, UNSCOP produced its partition report, which is called the Majority Report. Again, here, I think Victor talked about this a little bit, but I think these terms, the idea of a minority and majority in this political context, as well as in the context under investigation, is notable. The Majority Report proposed partition on the grounds of the unworkability of pluralism as a political principle. And it proposed the UN as the keeper of what it called international obligations surrounding the nature of territorial sovereignty in these two arenas and what it called minority rights, which is a term that comes out of the League of Nations, in the emerging states. Now, UNSCOP was operating in a context of a near absolute boycott of its proceedings by the Palestinians. This is something that other scholars have investigated. They objected to its presence and its task on the grounds that the UN had no jurisdiction over Palestine, and argued for the most part that the question should be submitted to some kind of international court. So I won't go into this further here, but it is worth noting the extent to which this Majority Report that proposed partition acceded essentially to the basic philosophical and political claims of the Zionist leadership about ethno-nationalism as the primary basis for statehood, and also about the political, legal, perhaps even ethical impossibility of ceding any political rights to Arabs in the context of Jewish claims. So there was a secondary Minority Report that was supported by 3 states, India, Iran, and Yugoslavia. We might note that 2 of those would eventually be subject to partition as well, that proposed linking the Jewish and Arab communities into a federal state, giving the UN control over the region's religious sites on the grounds that the mandate had failed in its self-prescribed task of preparing these communities for self-government, and that as such, any continuation of the mandate in any form, including the idea of an independent Jewish state under international protection, would bring the UN into disrepute, right? So the new UN would be non-viable from its beginning because it would be permanently associated with the cause of empire. It also included considerable commentary about how political coexistence between these two communities might indeed be possible once the destructive oversight of the mandatory power was gone. So this report refused to accept the impossibility of pluralism, right? And instead envisioned a situation where once the imperial framing had been removed, it might be possible to come up with some kind of alternative solution. So just to finish up here, what do we make about this of this moment? I think a couple of things, and I'll be very quick. One is that debate about Palestine was not only or maybe mostly about what was happening in Palestine, right? It was about the United Nations. It was about what would happen to empire. It was about the nature of this quote unquote internationalism that was emerging in very inchoate and uncertain ways in this particular moment. And I think Palestine becomes a kind of laboratory for figuring out modes of control and modes of political authority that could be cast as internationalist, cast as cooperative, while also reserving the power to make or break states. And to some extent, we can say that of the federalist model as well, right? Because the federalist model was imagining a role for the UN rather than an outcome for Palestine as both a mediator and as one where it would take an active and interventionist role in particular parts of Palestinian territory. So I want to close by saying that I don't think this is a story about how we had a better idea on the table and it was rejected in favor of a worse one. But rather, this is a story about the profound uncertainties surrounding the purpose, the direction, the nature of internationalist power in this moment. And that these two different ways of imagining that international authority in Palestine in the aftermath of formal empire actually shared a vision of taking active control, of international active control over borders and populations, and to some extent, actual territory as well. So I'll close there. And
Thank you very much. Thank you all for all your presentations, and I invite Nandini to please Chatterjee to talk to us about the book, but I will also switch places with Atef, and then he will respond after.
It's really a privilege to be part of this conversation, and I do apologize for not being part of it physically because I'm teaching in Exeter. I was teaching in Exeter this afternoon, and I have to teach early morning tomorrow as well. When Amrita told me about this book in the first instance, and then invited me to be part of this conversation, I thought that it would be really difficult for me to actually engage in this conversation beyond the level perhaps of an undergraduate seminar where I, for instance, happen to teach a module on British Empire and law. And in one of the sessions, we talk about Mandate Palestine, but I have so far been cowardly and stepped back from the precise moment that you have been talking about, and instead talk of the period of creation of legal institutions and the work of different groups of lawyers following Asaf Likovsky's work, for instance, during the mandatory period. Because I wasn't sure what exactly I can add to that conversation. But I think having listened to your conversation and having actually read this book in detail, what I can share with you is the delight that I took in reading this book. And I'll tell you why I was delighted. I started off by thinking that this is a work in comparative history, which is about the mid-20th century, a period of human history that I dislike the most. And also it's in the fields of international relations, sociological theory, political science, all of which are deeply disciplinary fields which I have very little expertise in. So I felt there was very little I could say about it. In fact, reading the book and then actually listening to, now it's just slipped my mind, but was it Victor who said that, or Arie in the beginning of your conversations, that what really inspired you were the connections rather than the comparisons. And indeed, as it happened, reading the book, it's the connections part that had like several aha moments for me. Some part of it is really about the pleasure in narrative. I was really interested to hear how, for example, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was deliberately trying to court Indian Muslim interest by, among other things, doing various religio-ritual things, such as offering the possibility of burial in a holy Muslim site, and so on. But a lot of this can be a delight in narrative and not necessarily perhaps add much more to what we already know, for instance, about Indo-Muslim transnationalism and things of that kind. However, I think actually reading the book helped me re-evaluate many things fundamentally. And for that, I thank you. And I'll point to three things that I think changed in my mind as a result of reading this book. I think, first of all, I had in fact been guilty of methodological nationalism in learning and teaching and reading about the Indian partition. And so I had not thought of partition as a tool of imperial governance in the first place. But having discovered that, and that was relatively easy to recognize, because if you belong to a post-colonial society, perhaps or have association with it, perhaps you've heard this joke before, wherever there's a problem across the world, you can possibly find the British imperial history in it. So at that kind of level, of course, like one could see it as a tool of imperial governance, albeit clumsy and destructive forms of governance. But in thinking of partition as a tool beyond imperial governance, to also thinking of it as a tool of nationalism, and as deliberately a tool of nationalism, not a natural outgrowth of nationalism on the first part, leading to very specific and violent forms of social engineering. And then finally, because of Laura's unbelievably important chapter, for me at least, and I'm sorry to not be able to give equal attention to all the chapters, although all of them actually contributed to my understanding, as a tool of internationalism as well, really has made me think of partition as something much more deliberate, much more comparable in the sense exactly of being this tool of social and geographical engineering, if you like. And I'm not sure where I would go with that, but just that has been again enough for me. To which I had then another thought, which was about migration, which once again I had thought of as almost an unfortunate but natural, if you like. And here is a warning to, of course, any reflexive historian. Whenever you think of any enormous human process as natural, it probably isn't. And I should have examined it, but your book has helped me to examine it better. So I thought of the mass migration associated with the partition in the Indian subcontinent as something natural, in a sense, of a natural outgrowth of the escalation of sectarian tensions and violence, but also of the simple fact of collapse of administration and the possibility of predatory behavior on each other. What I hadn't thought about is of migration as also a tool of social engineering. And a question that came to mind, and here is where I start moving to questions, if that is also okay, because I think I would find it difficult to separate the questions necessarily from my response. So I was actually wondering when I was reading Laura's chapter, as in whether there were in fact thoughts of compulsory population transfers in the district level divisions that happened in the Indian case. And if not, why not? What did they think would happen? And here is where you do kind of fall back into comparative history. It is a connected story, but then there is possibility for comparison for the dog that did not bark, as in why was that not one of those thoughts? Or am I missing something? Was there a thought on this as well? The other thought that actually appears across several of the articles, including, of course, most importantly, Victor's work, who leads with that concept, but I also found it again and again in Arie's work as well, as in majority rule. On the one hand, an apparently democratizing concept, and indeed, I kept thinking of the South African case recently, and so many things feel so prescient about your book, which was, of course, conceived before before the very unfortunate events that were escalated since October. So this idea of majority rule and how do you actually create conditions for majority rule, once again, I had thought of as extremely naturalized, in the sense that all you need to do is cluster those territories, which is the whole federation alternative, if you like, and majority rule will follow. And of course, majority rule was also refused, in a sense, by Hindu politicians of Bengal, who chose partition instead, so that they would not have majority rule by Muslims. But this point about majority rule, once again, like, made me think that I had not actually thought of majority rule in this tool-driven way. And the things and the social engineering that is actually required in order to make majority rule a possibility. And I'm thinking of it more in that kind of interventionist way. There is one thought, and I'll sum up with this thought. I feel I have been quite inchoate, actually, in my thoughts, rather than give you a structured response, because the book itself is very structured, but it's deeply moving, and that is how I've responded to it. My last point really is, am I wrong in thinking that there is something absolutely egregious about the complete denial of agency to Palestinians in the decisions that have continued to affect them until date? Because the Indian partition was, of course, a dreadful event. But if we, for one moment, step back and think comparatively, the level of Indian input into the process seems to be disproportionately greater than what the Palestinians ever got to say about their own lands and futures. And why was that the case? I mean, there's obviously the demographic, perhaps the simple size of the number of people and so on. But there is something particularly pointed, I think, and poignant about the Palestinian experience, which maybe also, and my absolute finishing point is also something which is the reason, which I invite you to reflect upon, is why the Palestinian case, egregious as it is, and I apologize for calling it a case, but I think this kind of instance of human experience, why it has been internationalized in a way that, for instance, Kashmir has not. As in, all of you in this room, of course, know about Kashmir and know about the comparability of it, and of course the differences. However, Kashmir continues to be nationalized and retained between this kind of bilateral conflict paradigm that Palestine has not remained confined to. And here is where I'm actually thinking of Mohamed-Ali's work, as in, there is something about the internationalization of the Palestinian cause, effectively or otherwise, history, well, the future will show us, which does not seem to have happened in the Indian case. And I wonder why. Thank you once again for having me in this conversation.
Thanks very much, Nandini. I think we won't respond immediately. We'll wait for Atef's response, and then we'll respond with some of the questions you raised, if that's fine.
Well,
Atef.
thank you so much for inviting me to respond to this wonderful book. I'm very glad to do so, although I feel a little bit very unqualified because it's my field is Arabic literature, Palestinian writing. But nonetheless, I have read Victor's work before, the first book that he published, which I thought was amazing and taught me a lot. And this one too really taught me a lot. So I feel more like a student of this book rather than somebody who really knows the details of everything and can talk about it confidently. But nonetheless, I was struck by a few things in the book, which is, for example, the first chapter, which we've discussed some elements of it already. The first chapter in the book, I think it's by Talbot, talks about partition as somehow really something, the outgrowth of the local aspect, the anti-colonial struggle and the massacre in the Bengal region, rather than something that is imposed by the British. It's something not the British have imposed, it actually was something locally, organically grown from there. And that the tone of the book from there on actually takes a contradictory sort of turn, because most of the chapters after that highlight actually the international, particularly the imperial British role in the partition element, and there's quite strong evidence for this. So I was quite surprised by the first chapter being what it is, and the other chapters speaking to something else, which is mainly how the British orchestrated the partition in India and Palestine. I was also struck by Victor's chapter where he's talking, which is exactly the point that Emmett has just raised, actually, that you have such agency shown in the case of, it seems like an imposed agency in some ways in the case of the Indians. So, for example, the leader of Pakistan, Mohamed-Ali Adraoui, was kind of often seen as somebody who wanted the partition, who accepted the partition, but actually seems to have been.
Sorry.
Sorry.
That was my mistake.
That's all right.
Yeah.
It seems to have been imposed on him rather than something that he wanted. So the agency in this case is imposed. But what we see, we have a lot of statements, a lot of deliberations, and particularly in the sense of the way Lord Mountbatten and others, I don't want to talk like a specialist because really I'm not, but it raises some questions in the sense that how that agency of the Indian leaders and Pakistani leaders came about. And it seems like in the case of Palestine, and I speak as somebody who's from Gaza, so you can imagine the horror of thinking about that situation now, how that agency somehow was given, but it's also kind of limited agency. It's a kind of imposed agency, or within the constraints of what the imperial power wants in that region, the subcontinent of India. Whereas in the case of the Palestinians, agency is really almost non-existent. It's others speaking for the Palestinians and implementing this plan. And then once the Palestinians rejected the 1947 plan, the partition plan, they're blamed later and ever since for not accepting that plan, even though the conditions at that time and the logic of the situation suggest why should they accept such a plan? Because it's kind of, a minority given much more land than the majority who owns the land. So I was struck by these sort of contradictions. I was also interested in Arie's chapter where he's talking about, I think you talked about a point that is not often discussed, which is the confederation aspect. And you refer to Lala Khalil's work, which I haven't looked at. It's quite interesting. And until today, nowadays in Palestine, the two existing mainstream sort of discussion about Palestine as to how to solve it, it's either a two-state solution, according to the resolution 242, or one-state solution, which is mutely discussed because the existing more powerful paradigm in terms of the US and other powers that have stakes in the game is the one-state solution that is not as much discussed, but it's there. But this idea of confederation, it has remained among sort of scholarly debate, but not even widely so. And I was interested as why do you think this is? It's perhaps a question why this is not sort of discussed enough. And also I was interested in your chapter, Mohammed. It's really quite interesting because you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and somehow the discourse becoming more religious and Islam being put, at the forefront of the discussion when it comes to the case of Palestine, and as the tone of opposition to the partition becomes more Islamic. And I was what I was intrigued by, you did for Muhammad Maslah's work, 1982, when he talks about Palestinian nationalism, is actually Palestine until that point is sort of regarded as what we call Janub Syria, the south of Syria. And it seems, and Izz al-Din al-Qassam also, which is works. The name you don't discuss him. I was expecting more discussion of that figure, but also it's because the discourse or much of the conflict around that time. It's around the Masjid al-Ibrahimi, the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebrew, or around Jerusalem. So therefore, there's quite a, by the very nature of it, there is Islamic discourse, but it doesn't suggest it didn't seem to me from reading other literature that this was the predominant discourse at that time. There was also nationalist discourse. In fact, it has continued to be the case in Palestine, except for the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when you have a more secular discourse being more predominant. But from that time, you have almost a competition of the Muslim Brotherhood discourse, which has just came off from Egypt in 1928, Hassan al-Banna, and so on and so forth, and more the nationalist secular discourse, which more goes with the spirit of the times, as it were. I'm not sure where I'm rambling with this, but yeah, you can get my drift, I guess. And really, finally, I have some questions too, which is considering where we are now in Palestine. It looks dismal, doesn't it? I mean, it's really bad. So is partition, what is first, actually, I will speak to the point that Amit mentioned, which is actually quite interesting, because the Palestinians are totally divested of agency in this case. They are, nobody from the Palestinians now is allowed to say as to how the solution, how they should be incorporated into the Israel is saying, Benjamin Netanyahu particularly is, in his dreams or whatever fantasy land, he wants to impose a solution on the Palestinians. It's not a solution, it's a destruction of some sort going on the Palestinians without any consideration to the local population. He wants some spies, some collaborators to work with him towards an aim where they don't have a voice. And it's quite interesting that this persistence of denial of a voice to the Palestinians until today, which is interesting and disturbing, very, very disturbing indeed, as if we have not moved from that historical moment, from that historical time in 1948, and actually long before that, when the British meddled much in Palestine. But the question is, has partition worked? Whether in the case of India, and this is really the question for the panel, has it worked in the case of India? Could it work in the case of India and Pakistan? Maybe this is a rhetorical question because these entities, India and Pakistan, exist, but you have Kashmir in the middle, two nuclear states. It's quite a situation there. And then Palestine, can partition work? Is it still a tool of the international order that exists that can advance the solution there? And that's perhaps is really my main question there regarding Palestine and India, whether it can work or not, basically. Thank you.
Maybe we can respond to Nandini and Atef's questions briefly from the panel and then open it for the audience. I guess, I think primarily in that law, maybe if you talk about internationalism and the role of empire, the meaning of partition, maybe start with Laura and then everyone can take it up if you like. Yeah.
There's so much to think about. Thank you both for these really wonderful comments, which I think are profoundly generative. I have thought so often about this question of why Palestinian agency is stripped away. And I actually want to say that I think, this long predates 1948, right? I think that this is one of the things about Palestinian history in the 20th century is how you can see this process unfolding from the moment of British occupation, right? And this is a question within the scholarship, within the historiography, and also within the kind of political conversation surrounding Palestine, right? About how this happened, could it be reversed? What are the mechanisms through which it has been enforced through these different political regimes, right? That we have seen a variety of political regimes, from 1917 forward that all have the same outcome, essentially, right? I don't have an absolute answer, but I will kind of throw some of the thoughts that I have had about how this happens and why Palestine becomes a space that is internationalized, which I think is a really crucial point, right? That it becomes, it becomes a space in which all kinds of other claims are adjudicated without respect to what is the population that is already there on the ground, right? So I think that the answer is different in different moments, but that these answers build on one another. In the first instance, I think that Jerusalem as a space, because of its place in Christianity and particularly in Western Protestantism, right, in the 19th century, becomes a space where imperial agencies can imagine a civilizational claim that translates into a territorial, right? And that this, unlike most other forms of imperial possession, this has support in the metropole at some very basic levels, right? And so the use of kind of biblical language surrounding Palestine and especially Jerusalem, which is actually not particularly characteristic of Zionism in its early years, it becomes characteristic later, but in its early stages, it's not. It comes from Protestantism, right? It comes from European Protestant traditions. And I think that buttresses the British claim to Palestine and the kind of broader Western understanding of Palestine and Jerusalem as a space that somehow belongs to Christendom, right? And that it is not the only explanation, but it is an element that differentiates Palestine from other spaces like South Asia. Now, the other thing that I think happens that builds on this point is that throughout the first half of the 20th century, and then particularly after 1945, Palestine becomes, or rather Israel, becomes a solution for what has long been regarded as Europe's Jewish problem, right? And this has a number of manifestations in the interwar period as well, right? There are people who imagine Zionism, people in Britain and France and even in Germany, in Russia, right, who imagine Zionism as a kind of solution to the issue of the Jewish presence in Europe. That takes on an entirely new valence after the Second World War, right? In 1945, when the UN is brand new and it's trying to figure out what to do with the remainder of the quote unquote displaced persons who are still in camps across Europe, right? Who will be there, I think some of you can probably correct me. I think the last EP camp closes in 1957, is that right? Something like that. So it lasts for ages. It just goes on and on and on, right? Why does it last so long? Because nobody wants to take these survivors in, right? Europe doesn't want them, the US doesn't want them. And so Israel, as a state, as an established place, becomes a solution for Europe's issues, right? And so I think that is also an element here that partially explains why this becomes an internationalized space and why the agency of the Palestinians, which has already been stripped away over a number of decades now, becomes essentially meaningless in the international sphere. So I think we have a long history of multiple explanations that build on each other, but it is truly remarkable, I think, that we could see Palestine as a space through the 20th century where these questions of global political authority are litigated through a very small space and very small populations, right? In ways that really do manage to almost entirely strip local populations of not just agency, but kind of the acknowledgement of political rights of any kind, right? And it is a remarkable story that and clearly we're seeing some of the consequences of that story now.
Anybody else want to respond to that and talk about it?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. And of course, we all wrote our chapters way before October 7th, but we are in a moment in which, for good and for bad, we're living in a moment that suddenly people are interested in what historians and scholars of these topics have to say. Suddenly, people understand the relevance. I used it as a motto for my chapter, a quote from Howard Brenton's play, Drawing the Line. It's actually about the partition of India and there's a sentence there says that scar tissue left by empire, dangerous. Scar tissue in the sun can flare up. We're definitely now in a moment of that scar flaring up. I think that so much of what we see now sadly strengthens the impression or the argument that many of us had that partition, as opposed to the older literature that thought that it's event, it has a beginning, it has an end. It may be a painful and traumatic event, but it has a clear ending date, is actually not the way to understand it as a political project. It's an ongoing, you constantly need to make sure, if partition is about engineering space, making sure there's a minoritization taking place in order to create this majority, it's you bring not only the tools of weaponry, of military, but legal tools and so on. So it's an ongoing project. And this is why these kind of partition spaces are these scar tissues that tend to flare up. And I also have very half-baked thought about why kind of the Palestinian voice is so often muted, right? And how come comparison that seem to us now after doing this research, kind of, oh, it makes sense, are not very prevalent. Yes, some activists are drawing the connection between Kashmir and Gaza, but it's more in the activist sphere. Not very a lot of scholarly works are following this and panning it out. And Laura made very good suggestions. I mean, there are several things that were I would add to the equation, not contradict, just to add. That in the interwar period in the 40s, the way it was still difficult to conceptualize Palestinians as a distinct group in a nation, not by the Palestinians themselves, but to sell, so to speak, to the metropole. You have relatively small numbers of very erudite and usually Cambridge-trained or Oxford-Cambridge-trained Palestinians that can speak to power. You do have this. You have very influential Palestinian intellectual George Antonius in the 1937. You had, of course, the Hurani, al-Hurani, and others. But the great masses are not there. And the way in which, of course, the Mufti is seen as an enemy, not only of the Zionists, is seen as an enemy of the empire. It's clear why you prefer to, in the metropole would mute that, and that kind of ties indirectly to your comment. And the double sort of boycott. When Palestinians boycotted these international forums, they gained, but they also lost. They render themselves also slightly muted in this item. I think that changed our sense is kind of now also something that was lacking in the 20s, 30s, and 40s is a Palestinian diaspora nationalism present. Now you do have Palestinian voices in the diaspora. It's not something you can read that, but it's very not these are sketchy answers. And I think that you asked about confederation, and I thank you for putting the finger on it. And yes, absolutely. I mean, I am torn here, and it's connected to one of the comments that Laura also made. When often in this kind of research, the metaphor I'm often using, and sorry for repeating myself, as we're going to the garbage bin of history and we're finding plans that did not pan out, right? So confederation was one of them. And I'm torn between two contradictory sentiments, so to speak. One is a bit of a romantic sentiment that I'm not the only one to be to be accused of it, of this romanticism of road no taken. Oh, if they would have chosen that alternative path, everything would have been rosy and kumbaya and nothing, and history would take a different path. And it is at the same time, and the other sentiment is that actually when you think about these plans, not because that was a premeditated idea, often they started preparing the ground to some way of imagining not partition fully, but segregation and separation. You start marking some territories as majority Muslim or majority Jewish or majority Christian. So they are also stepping stones towards the partition. So historically, they actually play this double role. So and it's part of the equation that is there. And I think that nowadays, when we're thinking about alternatives, so we need to go back to these alternative, to the minority reports, to these alternatives, but with a very critical, come with a critical mindset, not just saying, oh, if that was an alternative plan and it didn't work, it probably did. For sure, now we have a different blueprint because then we end up with the same logic of top-down engineering that did not benefit the region.
Anything else? Anybody?
Yeah. Do you want to come in, Mohamed-Ali, first?
Please, you first.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on some of the points that Laura mentioned in response to Nandini's question about why was Palestine internationalized in a way that Kashmir was not. So I think one of them is holy places, as Laura mentioned, and it's quite intriguing to know that, and the connection between holy places and great powers. So every great power in the West claims the Russians, the French, the Brits, and others claimed an interest, Italians, in the holy places in Palestine. And actually, when they first came up with their first partition plan, the famous Sykes-Picot agreement, Palestine was given a brown color. It was to have an international administration. That was the original idea. It was Jerusalem, but also other holy places and other parts of the country. And then the other reason why I think Palestine has been internationalized is because it was after the First World War. There's this idea of setting up League of Nations mandates, and Palestine being part of the Ottoman Empire was seen as it was a time of international relations when there was hierarchy and there was difference, and some people were considered more civilized than others. So in that pecking order, Palestine was put on what they call an A-class mandate. It was always judged about the civilization in a sense of European civilization, raising the standards to Europe. And it was because of that mandate status after the Second World War, the establishment of the United Nations, it maintained that distinction. There were two choices: independence or UN trusteeship. Palestine went for partition, but as a result, ever since 1947, it's been on the agenda of the United Nations as a problem. So it's been, again, the Jewish problem in Europe then becomes the United Nations Palestine problem. And in between all of this, of course, is the fact that the mandate itself was a project or an experiment, as Lord Balfour used to call it, what we would call social and demographic engineering, using modern expression. The idea was to encourage Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine. So the mandate made it much easier for individuals who were of the Jewish faith to become citizens of Palestine in terms of residency requirements. And they quotas, and they were counting and encouraging immigration. And this is, as a result, the absurd, anti-Semitism, and then the Holocaust, all these horrors happening, and yet they are still, even after the Second World War, there's still this encouragement to favour immigration to Palestine. And the United States and Australia and Canada are maintaining the UK as well restrictions. So for all these reasons, the UN status, what was happening in Europe at the time, holy places, and the fact that Kashmir was a princely state, and there was this big dispute over, whether they were, over the accession to India, that it was framed as a domestic problem, although I know Kashmir was on the UN Security Council in the late 1940s, and it's not clear to me why it's still not. It's not widely discussed. Maybe others who are more knowledgeable about this can explain. But that's one reason why Palestine, I think, the holy places and its international status and the links to Europe and the West, in terms of the touch and the population of the people, and then activism and everything else, is one reason why I think the Palestine issue gets more attention.
I think, if I can add, just because it's quite interesting, this point, just a little point, but Mahmoud Darwish, the famous Palestinian poet, really makes this very apt point to what you was just saying, which is that there's a lot of interest in Palestine, and he said it very clearly, because there's interest in what was described in Europe as the Jewish question. So the interest is not exactly really in the Palestinians, but actually on the other side, although the receiving end of suffering are the Palestinians.
And you see that in the Peel Partition Plan. There's this crazy quote where they're talking about the Europeans are the culture of Europe. They go to opera, Italian opera. They're like us. And then the Arabs, they're Asian. They have Asian civilization. They listen to Asiatic literature and culture, which we don't really understand. So that kind of cultural.
This discourse is now the Israeli ministers, when they're talking about the Palestinians, this barbarism, human animals language, the total dehumanization of the Palestinians is very, very.
And just to jump in as well, that as you said, it is post-Ottoman conquest. So really, the League of Nations is supposedly to end all conquests, but it does now, as Laura has argued, that it is an imperial project, despite it being considered an internationalist cooperative, and to recognize more.
Yes, what I'm about to say, I'm trying to articulate a few ideas, but don't take it for a super well-designed framework. I was super interested actually in my colleagues actually, because for example, I'm more interested first and foremost in political Islam, but I was trying to articulate this with your presentation, all of you here. And actually I was wondering, for example, I was questioning myself about the possible specificity of what we call Islamism or political Islam. For example, using these categories of nationalism, internationalism, imperialism. Actually, Islamism does fit with all this. It is a kind of very nationalistic mobilization in the sense that we need to define. So that's why, by the way, I'm going to answer a bit of your question, Victor and Atef, because there is, in my view at least, we are doing wrong actually. We are mistaken in confusing or in, let's say, separating by definition Islamism and Arabism, because actually in terms both of sociological careers and as well as in terms of ideology, you have a lot of similarities. For example, we were before the start, we were mentioning the case of Nasser, who used to be a Muslim brother. Yasser Arafat was a Muslim brother. The leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt used to be a communist, for example. One of the one who is now surviving in the prisons. So all these ideas of having clear, perfectly well-designed, well-defined, categories, we should give up on this. And I think, in my view, at least, we should, let's say, try to find boundaries in terms, bridges in terms of comparisons, but also in terms of internationalism, because Islamic thinkers and sympathizers, they have been calling for a sort of trans-Arab or inter-Arab, let's say, type of mobilization that today is missing, at least at the state level, but not at the people's level. We all have seen the World Cup, for example. Of course, it's just an event, but the World Cup has been extremely interesting in terms of understanding, let's say, the how should I call it, the survival, the ongoing, let's say, Palestinian, pro-Palestine feelings in the Arab countries, as well as imperialism. Do not forget that Islamism is also built on the desire to restore something called the caliphate. So is it this kind of imperialistic dream or not? But it may have some, let's say, may echo at least to this pan-Islamic dream designed by Hassan al-Banna that I was referring to in the beginning. And also, Islamism has to be seen, or maybe seen, as an anti-imperialist mobilization, because do not forget that all these people were also anti-Brits, anti-French, now anti-US. So look at how, this diversity of scopes or diversity of categories to which we can put Islamism. So if we consider Islamism as a third wordist type of mobilization, it also fits with this anti-Western so-called imperial power or imperialist powers. Mobilizations. Now let me go back to this issue of partition, which is one of the key issue addressed in the book. And I was completely, I was fascinated when you were saying that it's an ongoing process, an ongoing project. But look, for example, at the comparison we can make between, for example, now the ongoing split or rising split between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Some people actually, when Hamas took power, let's say nearly 20 years ago, and when we started seeing and observing this discrepancy, some people actually, I remember reading things on the possible comparison between Pakistan on the one hand and Bangladesh on the other hand. So partition is not, let's say, a 1, 2, 3, 6 month affair or issue. It's something which is designed, something which is intentional. If we look, for example, at the famous, the official speeches made by Netanyahu saying that I need Hamas to reinforce my policy, my divide and imperium, policy in terms of, because we tend to forget, sorry?
Divide and rule.
Divide and rule policy. So, which means basically that the main enemy of Netanyahu is not Hamas, it's the two-state solution. That's what it means, basically. So these always ongoing re-injuring processes in terms of territories, rearranging the territories, the populations, and so on and so forth. We are still in 2024 living under a partition plan paradigm. At least in this regard, as well as you were saying this. And I'm going to end up, I don't want to be too long, but about this possible specificity of Palestine, which if I look at this through this political Islam lens, which is completely actually something that I would support. Because, for example, if I have written on these issues, why Palestine is so important for Islamists. So I think that at least to be clear on this, we need to focus at who is saying what. We have different groups, Zionists, the Christian Zionists, for example, the Jewish Zionists, the Western democracies, the Arab states, the third world countries. We should look at, I think, every specificity on each side. But on the Islamist side, clearly, because of what Victor has just said in terms of the centrality of some holy sites. You were mentioning, for example, Azzam. Azzam is a Palestinian. For those who do not know Addam, he's a Palestinian, the Palestinian founder of Al-Qaeda, basically. And do not forget that jihadism has been, at a large degree, in the last 30, 40, 50 years, has been, probably know of some very famous jihadi thinkers like Abu Qatada al-Falastini, Abu Qatada the Palestinians, Abu al-Maqdisi, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, Zarqawi, for example. Zarqawi was raised, educated in a very, sorry?
In Tulka,
no, he's from Zarqa in Jordan.
Oh, he's in Jordan.
He was raised with Palestinians. So it's not only about ideology, also in terms of sociology. Sayyid Qutb has written a famous book published in 1950, Ma'arakatuna ma'al Yahud. So our struggle with the Jews. So in which he's one of the very first, maybe the first very important Islamic thinker to adopt this anti-Jewish narrative. So is it because of the holy sites? I think it plays a role, but it's also a nationalist, agenda, because Palestine is an Arab country, an Arab population. And do not forget that in the 40s and the 50s, Algeria, Egypt ceased to be a monarchy and starts to become a republic. Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, all these countries are going. In 46, Syria becomes independent, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to be too long, but all these ideas need to be articulated, I think, in order to progress in terms of understanding.
Yes, thank you very much. That was excellent. And I think because we have only about 15 minutes left, we'll take quite a few, like 3 or 4 questions before we get responses from the panel. There's one in the back, and then you.
The gentleman to go first because it was.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, just to comment on Jerusalem, I think don't just think it's important to Islamists. It's very important for Muslims generally. I didn't realise the significance of Jerusalem until I went there religiously, and Kashmir doesn't have anything in comparison. That's the truth of the matter. That's why people will fight over that. Come what may, you like or not. I just want to start before I make my contribution. A quick answer to our Palestinian colleague. If you talk to my grandfather's generation, who were in East Bengal immediately after partition, they knew what a bloody mistake it was within a year. Within a year, and they actually chose to go into Pakistan. Because there was one of the things that was mechanisms that you had in the Indian partition bill was plebiscites in localized areas. They actually chose an area. And that was all to do with Jinnah coming to Dhaka and announcing that the state language would be Urdu. So there were issues of language as well. It's another basis of nationhood. It's not just religion, which was the important thing. And the irony was, Nehru didn't actually speak much Urdu himself and said it in English.
And yet the majority at the time in Pakistan at that point were Bengalis. So there was, and since, I mean, one of the legacies, I think, of partition was the unfinished business of liberation of Bangladesh, the land of Bengalis. That was never really dealt with. So one of the questions I would like to ask is, to what extent, when they talked about partition generally, well, amongst the British bureaucrats, well, in Palestine, did they even consider another basis? Because it's quite clear to me, one of the things I've learned today was that both the Indian and Pakistani representatives in the League of Nations were saying no to the partition, and they were obviously drawing from the experience. Here's an example: the declaration of the boundaries was given 2 days after independence was declared on 14th, 15th. If there's anything that would cause chaos, small chaos, I can't think of anything more, because I think a lot of people didn't know which side of the border they were and where they were. That has never been taken on board. Just on that basis, I would like to know I mean, one of the problems we had was that Radcliffe drew those boundaries and he walked away from it. Was there a similar person who did the same in Palestine? I don't know. And two, I mean, let's remember, Mountbatten pushed this all the partition of India forward much more quickly than was necessary.
Thank you.
And did that mean the Brits from there went over and caused havoc in Palestine as well? Or was there a transfer of British bureaucrats from one place to the other? And if so, did they not learn some lessons at least from partition and in some points as well?
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for organising this today. I've lived in 6 Commonwealth countries to date. I was born in East Africa and I've lived in Singapore for a long time. And from my personal experience, I'm not a historian, I see connections between internationalism, as you said, Laura, and the agenda for perpetual war, and the weaponization of social engineering that comes through tools of division, which play a divide and rule mechanism. And this is how imperialism has been working for more than 100 years. You know, you can go back to the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. I've witnessed coups firsthand in places like Kenya, corruption, which enables color revolutions, uprisings, funding of rebels. The common underlying energy needed for all these things is money. And we have to, instead of looking at separate things like Pakistan, Kashmir, and India and Palestine, this is going to, all these, whether it's Ukraine or you look at any conflict in the world today, who is providing the money? Where is money coming from? Is the nature and definition of money changing today? Because the petrodollar is perhaps weakening. Maybe the BRICS will come up with another alternative monetary system. So has the monopoly waned? Is it having stage 4 cancer? The economic and political monopoly that has waged so much destruction in the whole planet because it was funded by the petrodollar, or before the petrodollar, you can call it, you know. So
that's a question.
Yeah. So look, I'm just wondering if anybody can comment on the money aspect, because if we don't look at that, then we don't understand how international agencies work.
We take one more.
Thank you.
Is there any online?
Thanks. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to all the contributions. Couple of points I just wanted to ask. Number one, especially regarding Nandini's questions to yourself, with regards to the link between Palestine and the interest in Palestine versus Kashmir and the interest amongst the entire international community. Because I came a little bit later on to the session, has anybody in the book mentioned Iqbal Ahmed, who's a very good friend of Edward Said? I think he may be the intellectual bridge which might give you a bit of insight into why in the third world Palestine is such a large issue, beyond obviously all the excellent contributions that have been made in terms of explaining that. That's number one. the interest in Palestine? Are you aware of either side of involvement, conversations, and contribution? Number two, I wanted to ask a very personal question to all of you. How free do you feel doing this research? I love the fact that it's been done. The link was sent to me by my sister. I'm not an academic or anything. I drive trains. But what's fascinating is the link is being made. I was so pleased to see so many different connections being made, which my friends and family have seen between the different issues. The issue of partition. Since a very young age, we were told, oh, partition was made for X, Y, Z reason. So I wanted to ask, what difficulties did you face in collecting the research, and how free do you feel being able to speak here today? And what challenges do you see with regards to your research, given the scrutiny now on these particular subject areas? So yes.
Thanks very much. And you take the.
Yeah, so the question from online is probably an extension of your book. And it says, Kashmir can be seen as nationalized because India is seen as a major operative. Palestine is seen as internationalized. Within that concept, Israel is seen as a major operative. Israeli nationalism in the area and world power support for funding Israel seems to completely undermine the internationalized concept. Why does the panel not connect positioning and funding of nuclear bases across the world with the current situation in Israel?
Very, very
Right. So we have, I think, only time for these questions. Some of them are more comment than question, but if anybody wants to jump in on the panel.
I mean, briefly on the language
Yeah.
issue, we actually have a chapter by Iqbal Singh Severe on partitioned identities, regional caste and national identity in Pakistan. So he looks at the imposition of Urdu in Bengal after 1948 in quite a bit of detail. So that might interest you. You also asked about whether there was something similar to the Radcliffe line in Palestine. Laura might know. I think it was the United Nations. UNSCOT came up with the line, but it was a proposal, and it was put in the resolution when it was voted through, but it was never enforced. So the idea was it had an enforcement mechanism that was to go to the UN Security Council, but as we know, they were divided, and so the plan was never enforced. I think the United States and the UK got cold feet when they realised that the Soviets could have a role in that kind of process, and they didn't want them to have that role. Another question about challenges to research. So this book was a project based in Singapore, which has it's got freedom of expression issues, to put it mildly, but we didn't have any problems doing this kind of research. The problems I find is when you want to discuss more contemporary issues, particularly, but although I might say paradoxically, since October, since the events in Gaza, it feels like one can be a bit more critical than before. But definitely the organising events, definitions of anti-Semitism or whatever it is, has caused huge problems with organising events on campus, and there's a problem of self-censorship was a big issue. But doing historical, I haven't personally had any problems doing historical work like this. It's more when I want to talk about current events or other issues.
Anyone want to respond to the financial and kind of money angle to international interests?
I can speak a little bit.
Yeah.
And I want to connect it to something that Arie said as well. Money is obviously crucial to this entire story, right? And I was struck by your comment about how this is an agenda for perpetual war. And I think that one of the things that happens from the League of Nations onward, which, the League as an international institution, what it was doing was ensuring that the channeling of resources to imperial states could continue irrespective of the political arrangements that might eventually transpire, right? So it was imagining a system of economic empire that could survive national independence, right? And the mandates, I would argue, are indeed an experiment, right? And they are an experiment in giving those empires time to figure out how this would work, to accumulate resources in such a way that political transitions could not interrupt the flow of capital, of goods, captive, the kind of, continuation of captive markets. In the Middle East, that's particularly true for oil, but there are other iterations in other places that have, there are mandates in Africa, for instance, where mineral rights are consistent issue in mandatory documents there, right? And so one of the things that the mandate system does, and this perhaps relates to some of the other questions about the specificity of Palestine, one of the things that the mandate system does is that it puts into place procedural methods for the registration of objections by the people, the subject population, that will by design have no outcome, right? So it has a petitioning system where people can put in complaints about how the mandates are not living up to their sacred trust of civilization, in quotes, about how, objections to the nature of what are, after all, long-term military occupations of all of these places, about objections to the kind of political representation. The petition system at the League is a place where complaints go to die, right? And it is designed for that. And the reason it's designed for that is not just because people don't want to respond to complaints, but because when you make it clear over a period of decades that there is no channel for peaceful negotiation, for protest, for demonstration, you force violence. And forcing violence on the ground is the point of this operation, because then the empires can turn back to Geneva and to their metropolitan audiences and they can say, see, they need us. They need us there, right? So violence is crucial. So violence and money are the two things that the system is running on, right? And the violence is not accidental. The violence is provoked deliberately to make sure that this process can go on and on and on to legitimize a consistent occupation over a period of decades and to give people time to figure out how to channel those resources towards the empires in ways that, they know some form of sovereignty, some form of independence is coming. So what the mandates are doing is setting up systems so that when that moment comes, economic empire will continue, as normal. So I think that's also an important kind of point here that, and Palestine is not the only mandatory state. And I actually think that the non-Middle Eastern mandates have been sort of underrepresented in the literature about the League and in our conversations about internationalism. But there's certainly, not least because of the presence of oil in the region, they're an operational space where these principles are being worked out.
Thanks very much. I know we are out of time, but we can stay here in the room maybe for a while and you can ask questions personally. Sorry?
No, I said that's nice.
Thank you
Not creating a partition.
very much. I want to thank all the candidates.